It's August 9th, 2015. I'm Arthur Falls, and you're listening to episode 3 of The New Renaissance, a show exploring the intersection of disruptive innovation, open source, and the individual. I got in touch with Sarah Perry, guest editor at ribbonfarm.com, to talk about how online communities differ from traditional ones and how those differences might translate into the technology developed by these groups. Our discussion revolved around ideas presented in a blog post of Sarah's entitled Weaponized Sacredness, which, among other things, explores the behavior of groups as entities independent of the individual people that make them up. I hope you guys enjoy listening.
Well, my name is Sarah Perry. I am a housewife, and I'm the contributing editor of ribbonfarm.com, and that's my main home on the internet. That's a site that I edit for and contribute to in collaboration with Venkatesh Rao. I have been kind of internet friends with Venkat for many years, and I invented the term insight porn, which is a term for articles or text or ideas that create the sensation of insight, and that people with minds like ours tend to crave insight almost like people crave sexual stimulation. So the idea of insight porn is something that provides that, and maybe it's a deprecatory term for that, but he offered me the chance to kind of be a regular contributing partner of that.
My goal really is to look at how internet communities differ from meat space communities, and then how that influences essentially the technology they develop or the technology that they inspire. Because there is this ferment of innovation that takes place on the internet, especially right now, and it's not professional; it's just amateur innovators, and that's really what I want to understand the culture that drives them and how they express that culture in technology. So, in the past, communities of all kinds were usually limited by their geographical proximity of the individuals in the community, but on the internet, we don't have that restriction. How might this affect the nature of communities that develop online?
Well, communities that are restricted according to geographical location tend to rely on like meat space ritual. You might build a cathedral. You pray 5 times a day in front of people, or once a week or whatever. You do rituals with people, hang out with them at the pub. So those tend to be the factors that underlie meat space community, geographically co-located community. Internet communities tend to be more made of pure information. So text and communication and rituals that aren't so much performed physically and together. So in a sense, that's really losing a tool. I think doing synchronized activity like dancing or praying together can be really strengthening for a community, but it also means they can be weirder and more different than any geographic community can be. They can also draw together. So people who are together geographically might be really different, and they're not located together in the same place so much because their personalities are the same. Internet communities can be much more segregated based on personality. So instead of just whoever happens to live near you, you're going to form communities with people who have the same interests and think the same way you do. So they're gonna be somewhat different that way, and that's another thing that just hasn't existed so much before in the world.
It sounds like that might limit the pool of ideas that a community on the internet has access to, and which sounds ironic. Do you think that's a contributing factor to the almost evangelistic?
I think there's 2 directions. One that you point out, that it can become a bubble, and that you're not hearing from your neighbors who historically might have had really different views. You're just hearing from really like-minded people. But I think also it allows ideas to develop that wouldn't be able to develop in localized communities. So pulling in 2 different directions.
And so, to introduce the idea that really kind of inspired me to actually get in touch with you, this idea of the egregore.
Yeah.
And could you explain the idea of an egregore, kind of what it does and how it relates to these online communities?
Yeah, an egregore is kind of like a god that's made of information. It's a sometimes called an autonomous psychic entity that's made up of people's thoughts and also influences people's thoughts. And I think we need the concept of signaling from economics to understand what they are. Signaling or costly signaling is something that's exists throughout nature and down to the level of birds and frogs and insects and plants. Um, if you're a peacock, you can signal that you're a really good peacock if you have a big, beautiful tail. It's really costly to have a big tail, but that shows the lady peacocks that you're a great cooperation partner for mating. That's kind of one-to-one signaling. People have developed this other kind of signaling where you can signal not just to each other, you can signal toward this god entity. So you can, as I said, pray once a week or 5 times a day. You can build cathedrals. You can dress in a particular way. You can do particular rituals, say things, not say certain things, respect taboos. All of those are directed toward the sort of mysterious entity that I called egregore, and it's kind of an efficient way of signaling to a lot of people at once that you're a good person, you're cooperative, you are committed to the group, whatever your group is. So an egregore is a useful thing, but it can also potentially kind of metastasize and become a very harmful thing. So um, egregores are kind of parasitic entities, but a parasite's not necessarily bad for us. Like our gut bacteria kind of are parasites, but they really help us. We couldn't live without them. It's the same with our culture. These things, we need them, we rely on them, they rely on us, but they can either be really friendly toward us, like our gut bacteria, or they can be unfriendly, like smallpox.
Could you offer some examples of egregores, and maybe some that are like the smallpox, and some that are like friendly gut bacteria?
Yeah, I think religion, that's usually religion that's transmitted from parent to child. That's in biological terms, that's vertical transmission. They really so an egregore can survive in 2 ways. They rely on us. They can either be passed from parent to child, and then their only hope of growing is if the population grows. Those tend to be pretty friendly, like our gut bacteria. Older religions, things like politeness norms, cooperating with your neighbor, stuff like that. The other way that these beings, these egregores, can breed and survive is what's in biological terms horizontal transmission. They can spread across the countryside between unrelated people and all around the world. Those, like kind of like smallpox, tend to be able to take more out of us. So I think communism in the 20th century and partly in the 19th century is an example of this. Really destructive, killing tens of billions of people, kind of spreading across the land very quickly. The French Revolution's another example that I think is a sort of destructive egregore that appears out of nowhere and spreads across the countryside. They don't sit around and wear T-shirts that say "I'm an egregore," so you have to look at them, look at human behavior in order to see them. If there are particular rituals going on, you can often suspect that there's an egregore. One recent event I've been thinking about is the kind of vilification of Sir Tim Hunt, the Nobel Prize-winning biochemist who kind of said the wrong thing, sort of a sacredness violation about women in science, and lost his job, was kind of vilified in the press, drummed out of polite circles, and that's kind of a hint that there's an egregore behind there. This sort of feminist egregore, the idea that's sort of a sacred thing you're not even allowed to joke about.
Because that's a disproportionate response, isn't it, to a view that he may have held in private, but let it leak out.
Yeah, and even that he appears to have been joking about in a self-deprecating manner. So it's a super disproportionate response. Apparently the substance of his talk was praising women scientists and kind of making fun of himself for being a bit of a dinosaur, and that was kind of held against him and taken out of context. But what you said, the disproportionate response, is exactly what we'd expect if there's a sort of sacredness and an egregoric entity involved, that it requires and wants a disproportionate response.
So how would you relate the word meme, which we're all familiar with? How would you relate the word meme to the term egregore?
I think an egregore is made of memes. That I like to use the term memeplex, kind of a complex of memes that's transmitted within a society that includes all the different ideas and culture, food processing methods and diets and rituals and dances and stories that makes up a culture. Those are also what egregores are composed of. So that's sort of the genes or the stuff by which egregores live.
I've always thought of a meme as kind of only existing in transmission.
Mm-hmm.
And the classic example is cat photos.
Yes.
Is the meme the cultural content of that, or is it the cat photo itself? I mean, with caption and everything. I mean, is that the meme, or is the meme the actual cultural content of the cat photo and caption?
That's a good question. I think the fact that it's funny to see a mind in a cat, I think, is culturally specific. Instead of killing and torturing cats, which is a past thing. An 18th century example would be very popular dioramas of stuffed animals, taxidermied stuffed animals set up to look like they're having tea or doing human things. So it's something that I think has some amount of universality, but it's probably culturally specific.
The poker playing dogs, right?
Yes, absolutely.
That's weird. I've never actually thought about it like that. Mm-hmm. But I suppose that is a cat photo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Egyptian hieroglyphs. Absolutely.
Right. I'm still trying to find a resolution to the meme as existing in transmission or existing independent of transmission.
I think that it has to exist somewhat independent of transmission because it still affects people's minds. So I think I take dietary norms maybe as a more general example of a meme. How to eat food, how to process food, what foods to eat, what not to eat. They exist in transmission, but then they continue to affect us even when we're alone. So if we have an idea that a food is unhealthy or dirty, we're not going to eat it even if we're not in front of other people. So I think they are transmitted, but they continue to affect us even beyond transmission. I don't know how that applies to the cat photos though. It's something that people really have in common that you can show that you're kind of a compassionate and you have a sense of humor if you can perceive that that it's funny.
I wonder if that's a kind of Turing test.
Yes. No, I definitely think what's his name? Daniel Dennett has argued that humor is an AI hard problem. That detecting humor is on par with any of the hardest AI problems, and that it's a very, very interesting problem. The book I'm thinking of is called Inside Jokes, Using Humor to Reverse Engineer the Mind by Hurley, Dennett, and Adams. I think it's 2012.
So basically, to bring us back to the word egregore, an egregore is made up of memes, or an egregore is synonymous with the word memeplex, or maybe a hive mind, or
absolutely
something like that.
Hive mind is a perfect synonym. Or group mind, yeah.
Except that in describing it as an egregore, you're separating it from the group and making it an independent entity.
Yes, because it's not simply synonymous with the group; it's autonomous. It takes on its own life. So we don't want to. I don't want to get mystical in the sense. I don't think there's like a separate kind of energy or mystical brainwaves that these egregores are made of. They're just made of people and thoughts. But this entity does become kind of separate. It takes on its own life. It does things that the group wouldn't want it to do, that no individual in the group would want it to do. So it's uncontrollable, and I think that's one of the ways that it's separate from the group. It's in order to be an efficient locus of signaling, it has to be somewhat separate from the group. But then it can, because of that separateness, it can take on a life of its own and do things that the group is not happy with.
Okay, and so because it's a complex system in and of itself, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I guess as the locus of all of the signaling, there's a complex interaction there that can produce unpredictable results, right?
Absolutely, and that's the core of what it means to be a complex system. There are emergent phenomena that we can't predict just from a definition of the system, like is it Conway's Game of Life, that you wouldn't necessarily, just looking at the rules of the game of life, you wouldn't know that these weird little spinners and guns and creatures would come out of it. So same thing.
So, how does information technology affect egregoric entities? How does it? Because we've talked about how they can be transmitted vertically from parent to offspring, and how they can be transmitted horizontally in the form of, say, communism last century. It seems that information technology provides a medium through which these entities could transmit their influence really rapidly.
Exactly.
And
starting with radio, well, print 500 years ago, then radio and television and internet, and makes it faster and faster horizontal transmission. So definitely something to be aware of and watch out for. New entities that couldn't have existed before have been allowed to exist by these communication technologies, and they can do things that were never possible before. And humans, we're kind of still running the same software on our brains, but we're connected together with different software and hardware than ever existed. So yeah, new things are possible. New good things and new scary things are both possible.
I'm actually reminded, and this is a little bit tangential, but I'm reminded of World War One when there were these stirrings of revolution in Russia, and in order to diffuse the Russian threat, the Germans supported Lenin and the communists over there in order to depose the Tsar and diminish the fighting potential over there. But ultimately, that egregore of revolution wound up transmitting into the German military and causing them increased problems on that front.
Very ironic.
Dan Carlin, you know, who does hardcore history. I'm not sure if you've.
Oh yeah, he's great.
He likened it to like biological warfare, but with an idea, which is exactly what we're talking about here.
I think that's a brilliant summation. Yeah, that it's a weapon that you really can't control, just like biological weapons. It's something that's very powerful. Of course, you want to get involved in it, but it often tends to backfire.
How does so to go back to this idea of viral spread and information technology? How does the medium, or existing in the medium of the internet, how does that affect the way egregores develop, and how does that affect the signaling that people use?
Well, information technology offers many faces for signaling to occur on, many things like the messages that you send, the avatar that you choose, both content and the style. Also, the people that you talk to, the ideas that are on the table that are okay to consider, the ones that you actively don't consider. So taboos are a way of doing that. I think it was interesting. We recently saw the Supreme Court same-sex marriage decision came down. All of a sudden, all of the big corporate brands had rainbow flags on their logos. So that was an example of an egregore kind of coming to fruition in this sort of sad corporate channel. Like, oh, we're supporting gay marriage even more than you. But that's, no matter what the internet community is, what even sending cute animal pictures is one of the rituals that makes possible. But other rituals, things like the scapegoating of Tim Hunt, I think that's made much more easy by internet connectivity, internet communities. Better things, I think, to be positive, I think things like Bitcoin are made possible by internet community. That would have been really difficult to get started and transmit before that was a possibility. Not just the computing power, but also the information power, the person-to-person media power.
I was talking to someone and they described Bitcoin as the mother of all memes.
Yes. Yes, it's my husband has jokingly described it as a supernormal stimulus for money, that it's money that's more perfect than any money that humans have ever encountered.
Bitcoin's actually something that's going to be great to come back to.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, not at all, because I talk about Bitcoin forever.
Indeed.
So sacredness in hacker culture.
Yeah, I think so. One thing about sacredness is that some people are more susceptible to it than others. Some people are naturally sort of like church ladies who are very pious and want to, respect taboos. And that doesn't just mean actual church ladies. That can mean, feminists and people who are kind of portray themselves as radicals, but maybe actually are really into just signaling the particular sacredness and respecting sacredness. I think hackers tend to be almost sacredness blind often. Hackers are often taken from people with very high IQs, maybe not neurotypical. Both computer science and mathematics kind of have this selection effect. And there are people who it's almost like it's just impossible to see why these people are wearing these flags and doing these rituals. Just what are you doing? So I think hackers are kind of naturally sacredness blind. They tend to be, but they also tend to be the people who care most about free speech. I think almost the only group that really cares about free speech or treats that as sacred. Back in the 90s, I remember when strong cryptography was an illegal munition, people would make T-shirts that had cryptographic code on them, kind of to say, well, are you so against free speech that you would prohibit a T-shirt? This T-shirt is an illegal munition. So I see that as kind of a ritual promoting freedom of speech and freedom of information. I don't see a lot of other communities doing that, and I think that has something to do with the kind of people who select into hacker culture, that they're not into the normal sacrednesses of respecting all the taboos. They're more into actual freedom of information.
So sacredness blind, but even in being sacredness blind, there has to be some sacredness in there,
absolutely,
though, right?
Absolutely. There's not zero. So there's still people who are somewhat sacred. I think Linus Torvalds and sorry, Eric Raymond, and maybe even on the opposite spectrum, Richard Stallman, although he's somewhat of a controversial figure. People who are somewhat sacred figures in math, maybe Paul Erdős, von Neumann, and Feynman, who are kind of people who can not people who can do no wrong, but whose mythos is respected. And there are concepts that are kind of sacred. These are often complicated and have to do with code, but and the battlegrounds tend to form around really practical physical things like cryptography and net neutrality, and what bits can go down what wire. Things like what's going on in Reddit now, what kind of censorship is taking place. That tends to be the battleground that people line up against, and yeah, that may be because it is more pure that way. It's more made of bits rather than made of emotions, and also the sort of self-selection of personality types into that domain.
There's a phrase that came up before. You said used the word, what was it? Insight porn.
Oh yeah. And
the counter to that was outrage porn.
Indeed. Outrage porn is another. I like to call things porn. The outrage porn is basically articles or happenings in the news that allow us to feel outrage against the outgroup, that we define some outgroup, whether it's police or neo-Nazis or sexists or whoever, these bad, terrible people. And outrage porn is something that just allows us to stoke those emotions. So clearly those are emotions that people like to feel. I don't know how good for us those are. It's probably good for us sometimes. I mentioned my little internet community has a holiday on Sundays. We call it Serene Social Sloth Sunday. And the rule is no outrage porn on Sunday. So you can talk about anything you want, but no outrage against the outgroup, however we define them. So whoever we might be making fun of on Saturday and Monday, we leave them alone on Sunday.
Back when 4chan, which was known as just kind of the most obscene of these groups online, was when Anonymous kind of split off from that.
Yeah,
it seemed like Anonymous went off on this tangent of outrage porn. Mm-hmm. They were these highly outraged people, and there was this real disillusionment among other members of 4chan. Kind of the spirit of the community was being adulterated, and ultimately that there was a schism there, I guess.
Absolutely.
It seems like Anonymous itself is this weird entity that is defined almost entirely by its love of outrage porn.
Indeed, that there's a deprecatory term within the community that I probably can't say on the radio that that they call the moral fags. It's I think one of the most interesting slurs of our time. But yeah, that there's this one part that's kind of about free speech and just having a community and being cool and posting stuff. And there's this other part that's about doing a holy war. Yeah, you could see that as sort of a, what is it, conquest? Is it conquest second law, that all organizations that aren't explicitly rightist will be taken over by left wingers? That would be the right wing explanation of what happened. I don't know. I think it's an interesting case study, and the move from 4chan to 8chan because 8chan decided not to. Because of the Gamergate thing. That's another interesting egregore of our time. That was kind of the origin of thinking about these things in particular over the past year.
What was Gamergate?
Gamergate is a big controversy where it started out sort of like the assassination of the Archduke, with a sort of silly little incident with the game developer who had apparently improperly used connections and slept with game journalists in exchange for positive coverage of a game. And it started a huge battle on the internet that's still going on. I think it's been like almost a year. It's that the gamers on the one side wanting to play their video games, and the sort of journalists on the other side wanting to criticize the games and say that they should X, Y, and Z. So yeah, that was an interesting battle that no one, I don't think anyone at the time thought that it would still be going on 10 months later, however long it's been.
When people agree on all these things, or when people belong to or find themselves in a position where they are signaling to an egregore, which they do compulsively. It's not something you don't deliberately. Yeah, well, I mean, it's a coordination mechanism,
Absolutely,
right?
it's absolutely a coordination mechanism. Yeah, to promote cooperation and connect us together, just like the internet.
We touched on the cypherpunks before, with cryptography and free speech. Mm-hmm. In information technology, cryptography almost seems like the height of sacredness. Mm-hmm. Take the cypherpunks and their development of, say, remailing technologies that were eventually picked up by the Navy to make Tor. While they were developing those remailers, was that itself an act of signaling to an egregore?
The values that are present in the community that they're signaling toward are exactly what created the tools. What they were used for later may be exactly what they were about when they created them. But I think, for instance, people work on open source in part because they care about it, not because they're getting paid for it, or even because they think they might in the future, but it's in part sort of a labor of love and cooperation. And so those things are absolutely products of an egregore.
How did they as a group coordinate and create this technology, and how is that propagated down through the years? I mean, is this something you can,
I think they have
extrapolate
norms. They have they don't necessarily include politeness, but they do have norms of how you prove yourself, how you become, how you kind of gain status and respect in the community, and definitely have values that people can signal toward. I think it kind of goes beyond that. You could probably pick them out in a crowd. They kind of dress in a particular way, often speech patterns and vocabulary, even into the kind of a dialect in which they might code switch into. Things like familiarity with the certain tools, including that, and that would go into the humor of the culture. That the jokes have to do are often in jokes that have to do with that require understanding. So it's almost shibboleths, kind of things that show that you're part of the in group, and they kind of protect themselves from intruders in that way, from hostile intruders. I think to some degree, kind of being uncool protects you from being taken over by intruders. I think that's how mathematics has protected itself from being taken over, and it's somewhat similar with the cypherpunks. If you're too cool, you're in danger of being taken over by lame people. But if you protect yourself with culture and rituals and shibboleths and language, then you can maybe remain independent and remain free and not be taken over.
And when you say taken over, I mean, how does that affect this meta entity
It might be replaced with a new one. It might be that when there's a sacredness battle going on, it's often a battle of egregoric entities where one existed in the first place and maybe it was weak and it got taken over by a more powerful one. So the battle in the Science Fiction Writers Association, the sort of science fiction egregore was kind of weak and ended up being taken over by what you might call a social justice egregore that was more powerful and scooped everybody up.
This is anonymous in 4chan
Absolutely.
Before the fact, isn't it?
Absolutely.
To bring this to Bitcoin, because that's what we're both thinking about, I presume, is sure. I mean, Bitcoin is the mother of all of these things, and we're kind of living now, I feel anyway, in a post-Bitcoin world.
Absolutely.
I wonder how you feel that's changed our view of the internet in general, and what we've learned from Bitcoin, and what we can expect from these online communities and these egregoric entities in the future in a post-Bitcoin world.
Well, one thing is money is a plausibility structure for a government egregore. So money is part of what makes governments so powerful as big entities. Bitcoin takes all that away. Bitcoin requires, it's trustless, famously. There's no central entity at all that you're coordinating with that you have to sort of signal toward or that has control over the money. So it puts all of the cooperation that there's going to be is between the parties rather than trusting the big giant government entity to do what's best for you, which of course they have incentive not to do. You trust whatever party you're sending stuff to, and you trust the protocols, which doesn't mean trusting any entity in particular.
Now, you say that, but I wonder about what about Satoshi's million, right? Because in a sense, when you do trust the protocols, where you trust the open source community to examine and verify that the protocols are secure and everything.
And embarrassingly, there's sort of an unintended fork going on right now as we speak. So.
How do you mean?
Oh, the thing I think it was just today that's going on with some of the miners trying to take a small advantage, not skipping over certain blocks, I believe, so that a fork has just happened. Not sure how that's going to resolve, so it's kind of embarrassing for pro Bitcoiners today. I don't know how it's going to resolve.
So is that like a selfish mining thing, or a
and mining is supposed to be, the incentives are supposed to be totally coordinated with the system incentives, but this is a situation that's just emerging right now that maybe the incentives are slightly off.
Cool. I'm gonna actually have to have a look at that. I'm supposed to be all clued up on these things.
I just read about it today.
So you've got like Satoshi. We were talking about these sacred figures, and Satoshi Nakamoto is definitely the mother of all.
He's definitely a saint. Yes, he's Saint Satoshi.
You've got these million bitcoins that he mined that have never been moved, and I think of that as kind of this idea of a reputation burn. He destroyed a million bitcoins, and so we can trust him.
Yes. That's a great insight. Yeah, that's a great insight.
Now that we have, it seems, is this with us to stay? I mean, what is the story of Bitcoin? Does it end in a gradual decline, or is there more to this than we've seen?
Big question mark. I think it has, just like with anything, it has the potential to kind of eat all of the money systems and become really strong. It has the potential to fade out. Some people say it's the blockchain that really is the core, and it's not Bitcoin so much. I'm not sure. how much I buy that.
Because it's an
But,
interesting technology, but it's so cumbersome, and it abandons all of the belief power that, by virtue of the fact that I believe a Bitcoin has value, I prove that it has value. I mean, you have this recursion.
yes, and it's uncomfortable to have it shoved in your face that that's how all money works. That all money only has value because people treat it as having value, and whether it's backed by gold or not, the just recurses to the gold itself that only has value because of this sort of group illusion.
Yeesh, Bitcoin. And so essentially these are all of these things we're talking about when we take it from the cypherpunks to 4chan, and then all the way along the spectrum, all the way forward to Bitcoin, where we see common egregores, like creating this chain of, or connecting this chain of influence.
Yeah, whatever's causing people to do the ritual behaviors that create the technology.
And those what's causing those ritual behaviors? If we were to distill it down to some really core, to some core factors that influence all of these egregores, what do you think they might be?
Some of it's money, but I think underneath that is the motivation for social status, and what the promise that egregores make, that groups make, is that you'll be a high status, belonging, loved member of this group. And I think that's often even more of a motivator than money. That's even maybe what's behind people's desire for money. That as a social species in nature, we're totally screwed if we're ejected from our group and ostracized, and we're really doing well if we have high status and are accepted and belong in our group. So I think that's kind of the core human motivation for everything.
So is this a new society that we're seeing emerge on the internet? I mean, are all these things converging to produce a new society with its own culture and its own? Yeah, I mean, and I understand that there are obviously many different cultures in all societies, but are we seeing something like this emerge in the same way we might see a nation or a people?
I think it's missing a lot, and maybe these can be solved technologically, but they're not currently. I think it's missing being able to dance and smell each other and eat together and do kind of the fun rituals that you can only do when you're together physically. We dream of being able to solve those problems with virtual reality and technologically, but the bandwidth demands would be pretty serious for that. So I think it'll be missing something if that is the final form. But it certainly has properties and possibilities that we don't have from geographic communities.
What about those who oppose internet communities or find them offensive just by their very existence?
Yeah.
Automatically, we talked about this kind of hyper-rationality, or supposed hyper-rationality of the individuals that self-select as say cypherpunks or what have you, and how they tend to not understand hackers, and how they tend to not understand sacredness or be sacredness blind. Mm-hmm. And because we know,
or actively try to mess with people on their so that's trolling. I think of as basically intentionally screwing with other people's sacredness.
Yeah, that's extremely bizarre behavior, and just the atheist obsession. This obsession with which shows a kind of a really fundamental ignorance about the human condition and just about how the world is in general.
I think so.
And so we have this kind of battleground, and I wonder what egregores outside of the internet find themselves actively in combat with these groups.
Anyone who wants to kind of impose their particular vision of sacredness on people are going to be interested in internet communities in general, and specific ones that disagree with them or don't give the proper signals of loyalty and submission.
I suppose the MPAA and the RIAA are. I'm not sure if they'd be. So, do you think there could be do you think egregores exist above the corporate level?
Above the corporate level, I think corporations can be egregoric entities. Above the corporate level, I'm not sure what you mean.
Like, do you think that corporations themselves signal too?
Yeah. Oh, I see what you mean. Definitely. Yeah. Whole industries might be that. on the coordinated industry level, corporations absolutely signal. Yeah, I was talking about all the rainbow flags after the Supreme Court same-sex marriage decision came down. But yeah, more than just that, advertising is hugely composed of sacredness signaling. You can almost figure out what your culture holds sacred by watching advertisements and looking at what corporations want to associate themselves with.
This is an occult term, right? The egregore is an occult term.
Yeah, yeah, from 19th century French occultists, and then was kind of adopted by modern occultists in the 80s and in the 1980s. So yeah.
19th century French.
Yes. Victor Hugo, weirdly, was the first recorded user of it. There's a guy named, I think his name's Eliphas Lévy, who he had a really great term for it in, I think it was 1859. I have it on my. They are the terrible beings that crush us without pity because they're unaware of our existence. That Eliphas Lévy writes in 1868.
For more, check out ribbonfarm.com. This episode featured content from Sarah Perry, music by Mark Emilian, and was produced by myself and Adam B. Levine. Today's magic word is ribbon. R-I-B-B-O-N.